Welcome back. I'm going to give you a little bit of background information, and on this lecture video, we'll also talk about the On Strike video as well, that small brief documentary. So how was ethnic studies, or the discipline of ethnic studies, established in the academy? I want to give you a little background on what was happening socially and culturally in the 1950s and the 1960s that led up to this moment of protest at California universities. Ethnic studies is a part of the student-led, student-initiated social movements that carried out in the 1950s and 60s. So it's actually in conversation with a much larger historical discourse of organizing efforts in order to address and redress the rights of marginalized and minoritized people. The events of the civil rights movement could not have happened without the energy and the organizing of young scholar activists. The shifts in 1966 away from the tactical maneuvers of the civil rights movement to the Black freedom movement with a focus on self-determination, liberation, freedom, and racial pride stemmed in part from a desire to see tangible physical changes towards Black liberation and equality from the legal wins of the civil rights movement. So the civil rights movement saw a lot of legal wins. A lot of things were put into law, but not necessarily put into practice. So there is de jure versus de facto. In law, de jure, in law, things were put into law, things became illegal, segregation became illegal, hiring practices had to be more inclusive, housing had to be more inclusive in the law. However, they were not necessarily being practiced in reality, which is de facto, in reality. In reality, most people were maintaining kind of the status quo. So what we saw in the late 60s and early 70s is a series of student-led movements that made what happened in the law a reality for us. These student scholar activists were prepared to use some of the tactics of the civil rights movement, but they also included self-defense and violent means in order to achieve their liberties. They had clear understandings of the importance of perspective and representation. So the fight for culturally relevant education that challenged and subverted institutional and structural power was at the forefront of the movement. People wanted to see themselves in their education. People wanted to have an education that actually connected to and addressed their particular experiences. And so we see this fight that is happening in the 60s and 70s. During this time, Cesar Chavez is organizing the National Farm Workers Association in California. And actually, he's organizing with Dorothy Huerta, who doesn't get as much notoriety for it, but she was actually quite involved in central to the organization of farm workers in California. There's an enormous population growth in the state of California. There is a industrial boom that's happening in California. And so we're seeing a lot of migration towards the state. So naturally, people of color who are migrating into the state want to see an education that reflects them. We have the free speech movement happening at UC Berkeley. In 1965, there is the Watts unrest that occurs. There are Vietnam protests that are happening. There's the establishment of the Black Panther Party of self-defense, of the Young Lords, of the Gray Panthers. There's the establishment or a shift in the women's movements and LGBTQ plus movements. There is a movement for free speech. So this is a environment that is really charged and concerned with questions of representation and social justice and liberation. So at San Francisco State College, on the campus of San Francisco State College, they're in conversation with this electrified protest and social justice organizing environment. In this environment, which is where the first protests or strikes happen to establish ethnic studies in schools and colleges, it's in that environment where in 1966, Jimmy Garrett and Jerry Vernado helped to create the campus's first BSU, or Black Student Union, in response to racial tensions, anti-Black police violence, and anti-war efforts there on San Francisco State College campus. 2 years later, in 1968, the Third World Liberation Front is formed. The Third World Liberation Front is a collaborative coalition effort between Blacks, Latino or Chicano is actually what they were referring to themselves at the time, Asian American and Indigenous students, or Native American students. The Third World Liberation Front was, to quote historian Jason Freire, it was, quote, a vehicle to politicize students of color, end quote. So it's always already political. It's always already invested in social justice. It's always already invested in a youth voice. It's always already interested in organizing and addressing and redressing the needs of people of color. It is a coalition for marginalized and minoritized populations at San Francisco State College. The catalyzing moment for the protest, the strike, was initiated because on November 1st of 1968, they suspended an English teacher and a Black Panther Party minister of education, George Mason Morey. The strike then begins on November 6, 1968. It doesn't end until March 20th of 1969. It is still today the longest student-led, student-organized strike on college campuses. So it is kicked off. There's a number of complaints that they already had, a number of things that were already a problem for them. But with the suspension of this particular professor, the students immediately went on strike 5 days later on November 6th, and they maintained their organizing effort until March 20th. The movie that you're going to see, which explains all this, Ethnic Studies 1969 to 1999, this film describes two distinctive yet linked and important movement moments for the establishment and maintenance of ethnic studies in California, college campuses and universities. The 1968-1969 strike, which was the fight to establish ethnic studies programs and departments at PWIs in California. PWIs means primarily white institutions, meaning that they had a very low number of students of color. And then in 1999, there's another strike at UC Berkeley that begins at UC Berkeley, and it's to maintain and expand those hard-run programs that they got from the earlier strike 3 decades before. So again, this slide goes over the information that I just told you. We start off with a Black Student Union in 1966 with Jimmy Garrett and Jerry Vernado. They create this student union. They are making demands of the campus. The Chicano student organization, the Native American student organization, and the Asian American student organization get in conversation with the Black Student Union, and they create what is the Third World Liberation Front. From there, the Third World Liberation Front becomes the vehicle through which they politicize their collective voices and go on strike on this campus. The strike happens after the suspension of George Mason Morey on November 1st, 1968. The strike is at San Francisco State College. It goes from November 6th, 1968 to March 20th, 1969. They focus on the admission of students of color. They focus on a number of things, and I'll go to the slide of the demands. But they're really interested in getting students of color admitted into the university and recruiting from the local high schools. Now, like most universities, oftentimes the people who are actually in attendance at that university don't come from the neighborhoods that the university is housed in. So if you look at some place like USC, which is in the center of South Central and Black and Brown communities, their actual number of Black and Brown students is very low. So they're not actually addressing the needs of the people of the community. But colleges and universities, in their inaugural development, were supposed to be addressing the needs of the communities into which they come, so where they're situated. Most of the time, though, because of the way access is disallowed for marginalized and oppressed people, we don't see as high a number in the actual university or college space as we do in the community that's surrounding it. So one of their calls was to actually address that issue, to address that disconnect and make sure that their university, their college, was tending to the needs of the community around it. They eventually were able to win, of 400 plus slots that were originally given to the Black Student Union for their individual protests, was then divided amongst the organizers of the Third World Liberation Front for fall admission of 1969. And then again, they won a few hundred for the spring of 1970, few hundred admission slots for the spring of 1970. The demands. If you look at this slide, the slide is full. I'm not going to go through all of the demands, but they were looking at maintaining qualified professors, ensuring that professors who were doing Black studies or other ethnic area studies were able to get full professorship, meaning full tenureship. That means that they were addressing the professors' needs, their salaries, their longevity in the university space. They were asking for, of course, admission of students of color. They were asking for that after strikes, that no disciplinary action would be taken. They were asking for faculty positions to be opened up to ensure that they had the kind of education that they wanted and that they deserved. I mean, they're spending money, and you should at least have an education that reflects some of who you are. They were asking that George Morey be reinstituted into his position. So they were looking for a number of things, not just admissions into the university, but actually gaining longevity for the department, a longevity for ensuring that the professors who were involved did not get penalized, and making sure that the protesters who were involved did not get penalized as well. In the years prior to the official strike, Black students had been organizing to demand more Black student admissions and the establishment of a Black Studies department. It's really important to have a department versus a program distinction at a university, because a program can easily be cut from a university. However, a department becomes a part of the university's culture, and it's very important for hiring, funding, and admissions. Departments are in control of their hiring, or they have some say in their hiring, in their funding, and in their admissions. These students understood that. And so one of their demands was to ensure that they were able to get departments created, not just programs, understanding that programs could be cut. Again, they were focused on gaining full-time professorships and equal pay, wanted to make sure that you could actually get a degree in the things that in these particular areas of study. They were interested in student retention, ensuring that people got through school, and that any of the students who were of color who put in an application for admission, that they were accepted. Again, the administration conceded to giving 400 plus slots for the 4 organizers, 4 groups to share. And they won a College of Ethnic Studies, which eventually becomes a Department of Ethnic Studies. And they agreed to accept virtually all students of color in the fall of 1969. After the success of 1968-69 strike, students in 1999 go on strike again at UC Berkeley, or on UC Berkeley's campus. This strike doesn't last as long as you saw in the video, but it does occur because, like I said, when you're a program and not a department, you are much more quickly subjected to the university's financial burden. So if it comes to a point where a university needs to streamline its budget, it will cut out certain programs, saying that they aren't important. So what they were finding at some of the universities in the late 90s on California campuses, that many of the ethnic studies or area studies programs, area studies being Chicano studies, Black studies, Asian Am studies, any of those women's studies programs, any of those kinds of programs were quickly being cut when the university needed to save money. So the goals for the 1999 strike was to challenge the status quo of the academy, to establish an education that reflects their histories and contemporary realities as diverse people, and to have an education that prepared them to be in service of their community. So there's 3 goals that they were looking to. They wanted to ensure that they achieved the same kinds of demands, or maintain the same demands of the 1960s, late 1960s, but they also are trying to add a little bit more and challenge some of the ways in which the academy had been continued to function in that 30-year span. And if you paid attention to the video, you see that they used all kinds of methods, from sit-ins to hunger strikes. They used any mode and means of protest. They negotiated with administrators. The response from the university was often violent, as protest tends to be. No matter how peaceful people are protesting, oftentimes the folks who are trying to maintain a particular position respond with violence. And so, yeah, if you have any questions about the film, please post them up in the discussion area for your questions, and I will gladly respond to them. I hope you enjoyed the film. Our next video will look at the Evelyn Hugh Duhart reading.